Welcome to Heian Haven. I'm Dawn. Today we're discussing Chapter 14 of the Tale of Genji, Miotsukushi. We'll start with our usual summary for shared context. Chapter 14 continues on from the previous with no real break. Genji's prestige and influence return to their pre-exile levels. Emperor Suzaku, Genji's half-brother, decides to abdicate, and the usual change in government follows as Emperor Reize, Genji and Fujitsu's secret son, takes the throne. Genji is appointed to the position of palace minister, and his father-in-law, the former minister of the left, is convinced to return to service as chancellor. The Akashi lady gives birth to a girl, and Genji begins plans to bring the mother and child to the capital, redoubling the efforts to remodel an estate left to him by his father that is adjacent to Nijo, where he can house some of his ladies, like the Gosechi dancer, and his lady at the House of Falling Flowers, Hanachiro Sato. Genji is reminded of the prediction of the fortune-teller that he would have 3 children, one emperor, one mother of an emperor, and one who rises to the top of government. His secret son is now emperor, his son with Aoi has been promoted and shows promise, and he now has a daughter whose fortune seems quite bright. Genji sends a nurse to Akashi with appropriate gifts, including a ceremonial blade, and finally tells Murasaki of the child and the Akashi lady. For his daughter's 50th day, he sends impressive gifts, and his attention soothes the Akashi lady's troubled mind. In autumn, Genji goes on pilgrimage to the shrine of Sumiyoshi to give thanks for the god's protection and blessings. The Akashi lady, who usually went to the shrine twice a year, also chose this same day to make her first pilgrimage since her pregnancy and safe delivery. She is pushed out of notice by Genji's magnificent procession and decides to continue on to Naniwa for purification instead. Genji is informed and sends her a poem, again making her feel a bit better. With the change in government, there was a change in the priestess of Ise, and the Rokujo lady and her daughter return to the capital. The lady's health takes a turn, she becomes a nun, and the sudden change alarms Genji, who rushes to her side. She asks her former lover to look after her daughter, but implores him not to have an intimate relationship with her. Genji agrees to treat the former priestess as his own daughter, and despite Suzaku's desire to have her for himself, arranges with Fujitsubo, now given the equivalent rank of retired empress, for the former priestess to enter into court service. And until then, Genji prepares to move her to Nijo to be Murasaki's companion. In Chapter 14, we are caught up on the lives and the goings-on of many of Genji's ladies and his relationships with them and other courtiers. We have a number of examples of a sort of marriage politics, as several ladies are prepared for and some presented for court service, often meaning to be consorts to the new Emperor Reize, Fujitsubo's 11-year-old son. I find these glimpses into the lives of noblewomen and even their gentlewomen, who were also women of some rank, to be fascinating. We don't always discuss the chapter titles, but this time we have an interesting difference in Tyler. Tyler is our only translator who strays from the traditional chapter heading of Miotsukushi, or channel markers, instead using pilgrimage to Sumiyoshi. Let's talk about channel markers, as Washburn calls them. Seidensticker uses channel buoys, Waley, the flood gauge, and Suematsu, the beacon. In Tyler's chapter title explanation page, which I'll admit is a feature of his translation that I absolutely adore, we read that the word for channel markers, Miotsukushi, which Tyler defines as a pole set in an estuary bottom to mark the channel, can also be read as give my all for love. And it is this double meaning that he and the Akashi lady use in a poetic exchange after Genji has seen the channel markers when he ventures to Naniwa and the Horie channel. It's the reference to this poetic exchange that all the other translators use for their titles, but Tyler instead focuses on the pilgrimage to Sumiyoshi, zooming out from the small exchange to the larger scene of pilgrimage. Does he think that that is the more important aspect of the chapter? I wonder. We have some of the usual translation differences. Suematsu leaves out a good portion of the chapter, specifically all the bits involving Genji's many women, but even the playful interview with the woman who will serve as Genji's daughter's nurse. We also have the usual mix-up of dates, Suematsu using February instead of the 2nd month, which is essentially March, and similarly, 5th month and May. The 5th month would actually be June. This comes up again a little further on in this video. But there's an interesting tiny difference in when Genji's daughter is born. Suematsu, Tyler, and Washburn say it happens on the 16th of the month. Seidensticker agrees, saying a girl was safely delivered on the 16th. Waley is our outlier here, saying that the child was born 16 days ago. From Suematsu's omissions, we move on to Waley's insertion. Once again, his intrinsic bias that leads his prose down the path of misogyny is on full display. Genji tells Murasaki about his child, and essentially asks her to be kind to it once he brings the child to the capital. Murasaki flushes red and asks Genji where she could have learned unkindness. It was a subtle jab, as he is the one who brought her up. Our other translators express her anger and bitter disappointment through her actions and a cutting poetic reference, but Waley makes her out to nearly have had a tantrum, describing her as having a fit of wild jealousy and resentment. Yes, there was jealousy and resentment, but she maintained her decorum despite her displeasure, as a lady of her station should. This is the second time I felt it necessary to call out Waley's prose, as I think it does a great disservice to a tale that focuses on the lives of women. Implicit bias is insidious. If I wasn't reading something different in the other translators, I might consider my own bias and sensitivity to the issue of misogyny as making me read more into it than is there, but the other translators make it fairly clear to me that that is not the case. There are two translation similarities that I would like to highlight, but I'll save one for our discussion of clothing. In both instances, all of our translators essentially give the same information in remarkably similar ways. When Genji's father-in-law has been selected as chancellor or regent, he initially declines. He is, however, convinced, as there is an example in China, of men who retire to the mountains while the government is troubled, returning to serve the new government despite their snow-crowned heads. And lastly, a minor difference that shows the advancement of better or more accurate translation. Genji is struck by the sight of the channel markers, the Miotsukushi, recites a line of poetry, and Koremitsu can tell his lord wants to write a poem to the Akashi lady. He hands over a writing implement. Waley calls this a short-handled pen, but this is the wrong word. Pen is wrong. Seidensticker is the first to get it right, with short writing brush. Tyler and Washburn are slightly more specific, using short-handled brush. Washburn added that paper was also given. This particular progression, because I'm reading the translations in order by publication, shows up time and again. Suematsu and Waley will use an adjacent word, Seidensticker moves it closer, and Tyler and Washburn provide specifics, frequently with a little more information or even a footnote. I often find myself questioning a word choice or clothing description by Waley, and then see that word or idea refined through the other translators. It's fascinating. The seasonal reference I'd like to point out is one that we've heard of before. Washburn calls it the idle period of the rainy season. Earlier in the tale, Suematsu had called the rainy season the month of May. But as called out earlier, we know that his dates are off, and he means the 5th month, or June, and a quick Google search provides that the rainy season is indeed June. Chapter 14 provides a rich array of intriguing cultural references. At the start of the chapter, Genji has a special ceremony performed for his father. Suematsu calls it the Grand Ceremony of Mihako. Great Ceremony of the 8 Readings is Waley's take. The standout translation was the Lotus Sutra by Seidensticker. I'll come back to that. Rite of the 8 Discourses is Tyler's translation, and is very similar to Rite of the 8 Lectures by Washburn. I was curious why one translation was Lotus Sutra and the others were so different. A little digging led me to the paper, The Lotus Lectures, Hoke Hako in the Heian Period by Willa Jane Tanabe. They write, one of the most popular of Heian rituals was the Hoke Hako, or series of 8 lectures on the Lotus Sutra. This was originally intended for religious edification and petition, but later developed into occasions for displaying and buttressing the sponsor's social position and power. This is what Genji had ordered, both to help his father's spirit and to show off the power he was now returned to. Once he has heard of her birth, Genji sends a sword or dagger to his daughter. This guardian sword, as Waley calls it, was something that Tyler explained in a footnote. A girl of high rank received a dagger, Minakashi, at birth. This dagger represented her father's protection of her. Genji's daughter celebrates her 50th day on the 5th of the 5th month, which is also the Iris or Sweet Flag Festival. The 50th day also signals that the period of confinement is ended. This end of the period of confinement struck me, and later on we read about the Akashi lady having not gone on pilgrimage because she was pregnant or had given birth too recently. Being pregnant was a time of spiritual pollution, and confinement was a way to alleviate that. This is something I'm familiar with in my study of pilgrimages of the Heian period. A woman was required to undergo a period of seclusion, ritual prayer, and abstinence in order to become ritually pure so that she could visit a shrine or temple. We read about the Ise priestess going through purification rituals before heading to Ise. These kinds of details delight me to discover. Speaking of details, Fujitsubo has now attained the rank equivalent of Empress Mother, though she could not be officially promoted, having retired from life and become a nun. But Waley says she was given a stipend equal to the taxes paid by 2,000 households. This was quite the change for her household, as the Kokiden consort's influence over the previous court had seen her fortunes unfairly diminished. Sometimes there's a line that just stops me from moving on. One of these is a line from Waley's translation. One cannot enjoy beautiful scenery or works of art in the company of any but the right person. I just want to take a beat with that. The beauty of nature or art can only be enjoyed with the right company. This reminds me of the advice Sei Shonagon gives in her pillow book, roughly paraphrased as, one should choose a worthy companion to go on pilgrimage with to make the journey more pleasant. Now, having the right person or people to see you is another thing entirely. That involves conspicuous consumption and power and a poem from the Kokenshu. In Washburn's translation we read, their efforts that day would have passed unnoticed, a wasted glory like the wearing of gorgeous brocade at night. This is in reference to Kino Tsurayuki's poem in the Kokenshu, number 297. Autumn leaves which fall in distant mountains are damasks worn in the darkness of night. And perhaps also in reference to the records of the Grand Historian, which Seidensticker puts in a footnote, saying, the Shichi informs us that to be rich and powerful and not display that fact in one's native village is to wear brocades in pitch darkness. The Shiji, or records of the Grand Historian, far predate Tsurayuki, so I dare say he got it from there, and it is likely something that makes his poem all the more clever for having quoted an ancient Chinese document. This sounds a whole lot like the rich are supposed to show off, as a duty. We're back to conspicuous consumption and other displays of wealth, like Genji's procession to the Sumiyoshi shrine. We'll come back to that. The last thing I want to examine in this section is what Tyler calls singing girls. This is a group of women who approach Genji's procession, who entice many of the men, but not Genji. In a footnote, Seidensticker calls these women of pleasure asobi, and asserts that this is the only mention of this class of person in the tale. I find it fascinating that in a tale that speaks about the lives of so many different kinds of women, there is only this glance at women of this profession. Asobi sang songs, imayo, and were known as sex workers, though they were classed as performers and not strictly prostitutes. But maybe this small glance is all that we are allowed because our author didn't have much experience with these women. A small mention that relates our author's experience or knowledge, much like the descriptions of servants being fairly short, but the descriptions of fine ladies, as she was, are paid much more attention. Maybe this was our author's way of actually including this group of women, where she otherwise could not. If you want to know more about asobi, I've included some links in the description box below. Let's move on to gifts. Now that Genji has returned to wealth and power, it's time for him to show that off, and he takes every opportunity to do so. Waley describes presents which lay about in astonishing profusion. And Seidensticker writes, he overlooked no occasion that seemed to call for a visit, or for gifts to the nurse and others who had remained faithful through the bad years. For his daughter, he sent a sword for the little girl and other appropriate gifts and provisions in such quantities that the procession was in danger of falling behind schedule. His attentions to the newly appointed nurse could not have been more elaborate. That was Seidensticker, who also translated, they took with them all the gifts which the most fertile imagination could have thought of for such an occasion, and practical supplies as well. We're watching the flow of wealth coming from the very top of government out, and we're reminded that many, many people rely on Genji's kindness, his affluence, for their very survival. And finally, my favorite part, the clothing references. There is a description of Genji's procession that sounds similar in each of our translations. This is that other translation similarity I promised to come back to. Listen to these passages, the first from Seidensticker and the second from Tyler. Here's Seidensticker. Their robes of deep hues and brilliant hues, like maple leaves and cherry blossoms against the deep green of the pine groves. And now Tyler's version. Formal cloaks, light and dark, drifted in untold numbers beneath the pine's deep green, as though the ground were strewn with flowers or autumn leaves. I really love the lyric nature of the description by Tyler. He often captures a poetic voice in his translation. This section is a perfect example where all of our full translations have a similar sound and description. The essence of what they all wrote is just so close together. It's in small passages and phrases like this that I feel I can hear Murasaki Shikibu. In the description of page boys, we have another instance of the description becoming more clear as the translation becomes more modern. Suematsu describes their hair as twisted up in the form of a double knot with ribbons of gorgeous purple, and Waley's translation is not far off from that. Their hair looped at the sides and tied with purple ribbon. Once again, it's with Seidensticker that we take a more detailed turn. The cords that bound up their hair in the page boy style, a most elegant blending from white to deep purple. Tyler refines Seidensticker's picture, with twin tresses bound by white cords shading to deep purple ends. And Washburn rolls everything together as he so often does. Their long hair bound in loops at their ears, with thin white cords that had been dyed purple at the tips. You know, I have some white silk cords I wove on the Mara dye. When I get the chance to try the right natural dye, I may make a pair of these cords. Color use in clothing during the Heian period is one of the special things I am interested in. It's the super niche subject within the niche subject of Japanese historic dress. It's usually women's garments that get my full attention, but in this chapter we're treated to fantastic descriptions of colors as they process by. Now these are all men's garments, formal court dress, or matching professional garb, but not quite like the 10 musicians whose dyed gowns all match. Washburn translates the passage about the musicians with the most detail. 10 musicians were performing a dance of the eastern provinces, all dressed in identical ceremonial robes, dyed with patterns of birds or flowers in bluish green, with red cords dangling from their left shoulders. The other garments match because it's all the same garment, just in different colors. The neat thing about men's formal dress is that the colors were prescribed by rank. You could literally tell a man's rank by the color of his hoheki noho. While there are comments about the leaf green of the 6th rank and the crimson of the 5th rank in the text, Washburn is actually the translator that tries to tackle listing off the colors associated with each rank in a footnote. 1 dark purple, 2 and 3 light purple, 4 dark red crimson, 5 light red crimson, 6 green or light blue, but we know from other translators this rank is leaf green, and even with this list, the light blue is a different rank. 7 light green, 8 blue, starting rank light blue, no rank yellow. If you would like to see someone else's chart of the colors used, I've included a link down below. The descriptions of the clothing worn in Genji's procession during his pilgrimage were my favorite part of this chapter, and I was delighted by the inclusion of so much color. These two things, clothing and color, are the real thrust of this project, so gaining those details is incredibly exciting. What stood out for you in this chapter? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching. Join me next time for Chapter 15, Yomogi-u. Subscribe if you'd like to explore the Heian period of Japan with me through the Tale of Genji.